Hi, my name is Ken Tate. I'm a professor at UC Davis in the Department of Plant Sciences. I'm going to talk to you today about riparian grazing management on rangeland watersheds. Riparian areas, which are wetland areas such as meadows and stream corridors as depicted in these photos, occupy less than 10% of western rangelands. Yet, these sites supply unique ecosystem services within this arid landscape, things such as aquatic species habitat. These sites can be vulnerable to excessive use by free grazing livestock since they provide relatively high quality forage and drinking water within this arid landscape. They're often sought out by livestock, much as they're sought out by wildlife species. There's a substantial body of case studies and research which demonstrate the negative outcomes of management primarily to optimize meat and fiber. Oftentimes in the past, there was an era of management where the potential negative outcomes on riparian areas were secondary to the optimization of forage harvest across this entire landscape, which led to excessive use and excessive time spent and excessive degradation of riparian areas by grazing management. If we think about what unmanaged or unfriendly riparian grazing might look like and some of the outcomes, first there's damage to riparian vegetation by excessive defoliation by livestock. This can result in bare and unstable stream banks due to reduction in vegetative cover, but also due to physical damage to stream banks by livestock hooves. This can result in stream channel erosion, which, if allowed to occur, can create a loss of water table and habitat and water quality, basically a tumbling of the ecosystem services that are provided by these riparian sites. And it's important to think and realize that sometimes we can cross a threshold with a riparian area where if it were to erode to such an extent that once this threshold is passed, recovery, restoration, if you will, of that channel is difficult with prescribed grazing management alone. If you look at the graphic at the bottom, we think about ecosystem services provided on the vertical axis, and the degradation pathway is shown along the horizontal axis. The ball is the condition of that site, its health, if you will, at any given time. And you can see that red arrow is basically management, in this case, unmanaged riparian grazing. That stressor can push the condition of that channel kind of over a ledge, over a threshold, to a much lower level. And reversing that process is not straightforward without a serious intervention and expensive resource. So we really don't want to cross that threshold. So thinking then about the steps, the processes by which unmanaged riparian grazing can lead to that type of loss of ecosystem services. So back to, remember, if we have unmanaged riparian grazing that's allowing chronic, heavy livestock grazing to occur within a riparian area, over time, what that'll do is it'll reduce plant rooting mass and depth. It'll reduce the vigor of the plants that are there, their overall health, and it'll reduce their competitiveness, which is their ability to hold that site against invasive species, whether they be native or not. And it's really important in many of these riparian areas, the roots of these riparian plants, particularly the herbaceous plants, the sedges and the grasses and the other plants that are there, have high root density in a healthy condition, and that provides a lot of strength to those stream banks and holds them together against erosive conditions. And then chronic heavy grazing can lead to physical hoof damage to stream banks, as you can kind of see in this particular photo. That sets us up for a condition where we can have excessive stream bank and channel instability, which increases the risk of soil and channel erosion, which once that begins to occur, and if not checked fairly quickly in many cases, you can end up with catastrophic channel failure where you have extreme downcutting or widening, entrenching of the stream channel, which reduces the depth, increases the depth of the water table, reduces productivity, and reduces the habitat value of this site, and as indicated before, can be quite difficult and expensive to recover from. Fortunately, there's a contemporary research body that also demonstrates the effectiveness of conservation riparian grazing management. And conservation riparian grazing management is management that's put in place where riparian goals are equal to the production goals that exist for a landscape. So looking at the balancing act below, that's where we're basically instilling management that obviously recognizes the need for profitability in an operation, but in balance with the other ecosystem services that we expect to get from that landscape. And there are riparian grazing management tools and strategies in existence which will allow us to achieve that balance and not allow those detrimental processes that I demonstrated before to occur. So thinking then about managed riparian grazing. So first and foremost, we have to set both agricultural and riparian enhancement goals. When we only have agricultural goals and we do not have riparian management or enhancement goals, then we're really not going to very likely achieve riparian improvement because it's not part of our management strategy overall. So we've got to set goals for our riparian area as well as for the operation. We have to set reasonable targets for livestock browse on desired plants and disturbance to stream banks. We have to have triggers where we achieve a certain level of use of riparian plants or a certain level of disturbance of soil or stream banks, and that's a trigger that is a target, and when we achieve that target, we move those livestock or we reduce grazing pressure so that we don't pass those triggers. Because when we get to those triggers, we're beginning to get to the point where long-term detrimental impacts can occur if we pass those points on a regular basis. And then we have to prescribe timing and season of grazing to meet these targets, to achieve these goals for every grazing bout. And then we put those practices in place, we observe them, we adapt if we're not meeting our targets, we observe again, we adapt as necessary, basically using the adaptive management framework to find the correct site-specific set of strategies or practices to achieve our riparian goals. And then we're in a situation where we've got the site, back to this graphic, where we've got ecosystem services and the pathway of degradation, where we're keeping our site condition high with lots of ecosystem services being provided, and we're using prescribed grazing management to offset the common negative outcomes of unmanaged riparian grazing. We're basically pushing that ball away from that threshold and keeping the site in a good condition with those management strategies. So we did a study where we looked across California. We did a survey of 130 grazed riparian areas, looking at streams ranging from excellent to poor health. And we went out and we assessed the health of these streams from multiple aspects. And then we also examined which practices, grazing management practices, were occurring on those sites and looked at this entire data set statistically to figure out which practices were associated with excellent and poor health. So then let's look at some of the results from that survey of grazed riparian areas across the state. We're looking at what management practices are correlated, either positively or negative, to riparian health. We found that the use of off-stream livestock attractants, such as drinking water tanks, and supplements such as salt or hay, the amount of time, person time spent per year, making sure livestock are finding those attractants, that those attractants are working as they should, placing that salt in locations where it needs to be to attract livestock away from riparian areas, to reduce the amount of time and thus impact that those riparian areas receive from livestock, that there's a positive correlation between this activity and riparian health. We found a positive correlation between the time-old practice of herding livestock to control utilization in riparian areas and time spent in riparian areas. So the more time, person days per year, that individuals spent moving livestock away from riparian areas and getting them to use upland areas was positively correlated with riparian health. We found that rest period duration, the amount of days per year that a pasture, a riparian pasture, is rested from livestock, was positively correlated with riparian health. We know that rest from defoliation during the growing season is an important component of any grazing strategy to achieve both optimal productivity, but also to achieve environmental protection. So these results are not surprising. We found on the negative side that as we increase the grazing duration in terms of days grazed per year in a riparian unit, we saw an associated on average reduction in riparian health. As we increased livestock density, the number of head per acre during grazing bouts, we found a reduction in riparian health. And as we increase the frequency of grazing bouts during a year, we go from 2 grazing bouts in a riparian area to 4 grazing bouts in a riparian area, say per year, per growing season. We found that that was associated with a reduction in riparian health on average across these 130 sites enrolled in this study. So basically, we see a negative relationship between riparian health as measured by bank stability or the ability of that channel to access its floodplain and dissipate flood flow, the richness and diversity of the in-stream macroinvertebrate or insect community, the filtration capacity of those sites. Those benefits or services were all reduced as we saw an increasing overall in grazing intensity, duration, and frequency at a site. We found there was a positive relationship between practices and effort, management effort, to limit utilization and frequency of grazing in riparian areas. Basically, we saw increases in these same ecosystem services on average as we increased effort in herding or salting or somehow distributing livestock across the landscape and away from these critical areas. And so thinking about how to implement and how to put these practices into play, one way to think about it is as you increase livestock density, the number of animals head per acre in a site, use shorter grazing bouts, graze less frequency. If you're going to have lower densities, perhaps you can graze for longer or more frequent bouts, depending on your objectives and the logistics. But we know that as we increase livestock density, we're going to have to use shorter and less frequent grazing bouts, as one example. We found a very strong positive correlation between the use of off-stream water and supplement. So we know that moving those attractants away from riparian areas, making sure that they're available, making sure that they're operational, will be a good practice not only for improving riparian areas, but distributing foraging livestock into upland areas where there may be unused forage previous to that management effort. We found strong positive correlations with the act of herding. This is a large landscape. It's a diverse landscape. And herding is a very effective tool to move livestock around these landscapes and distribute them away from riparian areas and into upland grazing areas. That, used in conjunction with well-placed water and salt, together those can work quite well. So some key points to take home from this. Riparian enhancement must be a goal. If riparian enhancement is not part of our overall management strategy for the ranch and the landscape, it's unlikely we're going to see improvement in riparian conditions. A grazing toolbox is required, not a magic bullet. It's important to remember that we use these tools to no single tool, whether it be herding or fencing, is going to solve the problem magically. We have to work as if we have a toolbox at hand, which we do. Every site is different, and it changes over time. And so we have to have site-specific adaptive grazing management that's site-specific and tailored to that site. Whatever riparian grazing management we recommend or put in place, it's going to have to be logistically and economically feasible. The manager is going to have to be able to make it part of their day-to-day business so that it occurs on a regular basis, because that's essential to achieving the outcomes that we're looking for. And then, kind of along those lines, we have to remember that these riparian areas are part of a larger ranch, and they're part of a larger landscape, and they're part of a larger grazing management plan for an entire herd of livestock, which have to be someplace 24/7. And so we need to think about how our riparian grazing management goals and potential strategies fit into an overall ranch management plan that'll help with the logistic feasibility. Thank you very much.
You can find more informative presentations covering ranch water quality topics on the UC Rangelands website, and look for the Water Quality Information Hub or direct your web browser to the URL shown on this slide.